is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing my January wrap-up. First, let's start off with some statistics. So in the month of January, I read 11 books and DNF'd only one. Of those 11 books, 72% were audiobooks, 18% were physical books, and 9% were ebooks. 63% of those books were by white authors, 18% were by Black authors, 9% by Asian authors, and another 9% by Swana authors. So this includes Southwestern Asia and Northern Africa. And 5 of the books that I read this month were either by a queer author or included queer themes. My average star rating was about 3 stars, and I read from authors who came from 4 different countries this month. The first book that I started the year off with was The Perfect Crimes of Marian by Sebastian. This is the second book in the London Highwaymen series, and I'm not sure if this is going to be the last book in the series or if they're going to continue on with more of them. This was a pretty good sequel. I enjoyed learning more about Marian. I really liked the exploration of her backstory here, and especially the depictions of her struggling with postpartum traumatic stress disorder, and her, really having these adult conversations with her partner about what she views as intimacy and her history and her views on motherhood and how these things have changed over time. I loved her as a character. The male main character, I enjoyed learning more about him from the first book, but I didn't particularly connect enough with him compared to how strongly I felt about Marian in this book. I thought their steamy scenes together were really good, but I don't necessarily think that I loved them together as a couple. I enjoyed seeing my favorite characters from the first book return, but overall, I wasn't fully in love with this one. I thought it was just okay, an interesting story, but nothing that really wowed me, especially considering how high my expectations were from the first book. So I ended up giving this one 3 stars. The second book that I read was a poetry collection by Benjamin Zephaniah, Propa Propaganda. This was fascinating to me because it's kind of a blend of some of his more famous poems and poems that he openly admits he forgot about, like he forgot to publish them in another collection, or he lost the poem for many years. So there was kind of this like comedic underlying tone to the collection. I really enjoyed this though. I thought that this collection really brought to life Zephaniah's love of culture and community, especially Caribbean culture, and how this influenced him and the Black British Caribbean diaspora community that he was raised within. I really loved how he constantly appeals to people to see the humanity in others and to really humanize even the most simple of experiences that people go through. I also found that his prose had such a lyrical feel to it, and I really loved that. I looked up some of his poems to see him read them, and that was a really beautiful experience. I hadn't read a lot of his work before this. I think I'd only read like a poem here or there. And I feel like I've been denying myself in doing that because, wow, I am really in awe of his writing. And it's such a reminder that it's so incredibly sad that he's no longer with us. So now the hunt begins for as much of his poetry as I can find and consume. In terms of star rating, I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. And that's really because I do think there are some problems with the organization of the collection in terms of some of the poems that were kind of randomly thrown in. Granted, there is a self-awareness of this, and Benjamin Zephaniah like kind of pokes fun at the fact that he did this. However, that lessened my enjoyment of the collection as a whole. So again, I don't think it was flawless, but it's certainly worth the time spent with it. Next, I read another poetry collection. This one was Oceanic by Aimee, Nezhukumatathil. And I previously read her collection Lucky Fish for the Sealy Challenge last summer. And I really liked it. I was really excited for this one because it was supposed to be like poetry inspired by the ocean, oceanic creatures, and I don't think it really is. I think this is kind of marketed wrong. Although there are reflections about the ocean and oceanic animals, it's more about the natural world in general, and there's also a section of the collection that's more about love poetry that, again, kind of, I could see why it was there, but I felt like this collection didn't really have a strong enough guiding theme through it, and so there were all these little themes together, loosely connected through the natural world, but it wasn't strong enough for me. It just needed a little something more, and I'm not sure if it needed like more structural organization in terms of creating sections based on certain themes, or if it needed some of the poems to be reorganized or some poems to be removed. It just didn't work as a collection for me overall. I still enjoyed a couple poems, but really only like a couple out of the entire book. I was a little bit disappointed in this, if I'm honest, because I really love her poetry style, but I don't think that this collection was organized in a way that makes her poetry accessible, and maybe that's not the point. But again, this is just how I felt about the collection. I gave it 3 out of 5 stars, and I think that there's definitely an audience for this collection. It just was unfortunately not me. Next, I read the much beloved Beartown by Fredrik Backman. This is translated from the Swedish by Neil Smith, and this is a very loved book, and I definitely understand why. I was really shocked with how much I enjoyed this book. I think it's such an interesting examination of small town life. And even though this is a small town in rural Sweden, I think it appeals to a larger audience of people who have grown up in similar small towns all around the world. I was initially very hesitant of this book because I heard that it's a hockey story, but it's a lot more than a hockey story. There are some really amazingly poignant observations about not just small town life, but also human nature and different types of interactions with different people in our lives and social groups and all of these things. I really, really enjoyed this. I'm definitely considering it a favorite because I don't think I've ever read a book that so just perfectly encapsulates real people. As someone who grew up in a small town, I can really envision all these different types of people together. And even though there are characters that I certainly strongly disliked or hated in this book, I don't think that they were overly dramatic or exaggerated. I think that there are genuinely, unfortunately, some people like those characters. I also love how Backman created this character out of the town itself, and like there are all these places in the town that you feel like not only are a center for community, but a center for the story. And I really love stories, or I guess I should say rather, authors who can create stories where the setting feels so very alive. And I think Backman really excelled at this. Obviously, Neil Smith's translation is also something to praise in this, because I'm assuming this was a really amazing translation since it was so incredibly well done. I am excited to read more of the series. I originally thought it was a standalone, but I found out that it's now, I think, a trilogy, possibly more books, not sure. But I've heard that the series gets better and better as it explores different parts of the story we left off with, but also, of course, eventually adds in new plot lines and some new characters over time. The next book I read was Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher, and this was a pretty big disappointment for me. I'm a big fan of T. Kingfisher's Sworn Soldier series, and Nettle and Bone was one of their previous books that I had heard a lot about. There was a lot of buzz, but I had never felt pulled to actually pick it up. Now I understand why that is. I think this book finally solidified for me that I don't enjoy fairy tale-like books. I don't enjoy books that are like retelling a fairy tale or trying to make a modern fairy tale or just have those fairy tale atmospheric vibes, because that was my biggest issue with this, is that I felt like this book was trying to be like a medieval fairy tale, but it just didn't work for me. I understand that this is a novella, so it's a little faster paced, but I oddly thought that this book was a little bit too long. I thought that certain parts of the story I just didn't care about. And one of those parts is actually a pretty important plot line because it's about a romance that develops, and I truly could not have cared less. I didn't really care for the characters. I didn't really care about the again, the romance aspects to this story. The journey stuff was interesting, but only so far as like, okay, we learned a little bit more about this magic system that initially was interesting, but there was such a delayed explanation for those things that I didn't care by the time that we got around to some of those big reveals. I know T. Kingfisher has written across many different genres, so I think that this is just one that is not my cup of tea. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars because I still thought the writing was good in this, and again, there were certain limited aspects of the story that I enjoyed. This as a genre fiction, not my taste, and it definitely taught me that for sure about my future reading plans. The next book I was really excited for because I had been on quite a wait list for it, and it was The Titan's Curse, the 3rd book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series by Riordan. I started this series in the end of 2024. Books 3, 4, and 5 oddly had a really long wait list at my library. So the 3rd book finally became available about like mid-January, so a month and a half really of waiting. And I have to say that this is my least favorite book. in the series. I can appreciate that they wanted to introduce new characters and they were trying to, expand a little bit of the lore of the world. But I feel like this book was just so different to the previous two. Like, obviously there's a different central group of characters, but even a character that was introduced at the end of book 2 that left me so excited for book 3, that story arc just fell so flat for me. It felt so limiting, and the new characters we get in this book didn't feel fully formed. A lot of them felt like plot devices, and I just didn't like the dynamics that I did appreciate in the first 2 books. I think the story was a little bit too drawn out in this, and there is a really interesting reveal, but I don't think it was worth the length of this book. Like, something about this felt incredibly long, and I think it's because it takes them so long to actually get to like the point of the task. I didn't feel like this necessarily engaged the reader enough with like the mythology. Like, some of it is just kind of shoehorned in or info dumped, whereas in the first few books it seemed more naturally embedded in the story. And yeah, this one just felt like an odd one out in the series. I gave it 3 stars. I didn't think it was terrible. It was just definitely my least favorite so far. Then I picked up a graphic novel. This was Lumberjanes Volume 1, Beware the Kitten Holy by N.D. Stevenson. This is about a group of female campers who are in like a fictionalized Girl Scouts group, and they have a summer camp where these mythical creatures start popping up everywhere. I guess not all of them are mythical creatures. They're more just like creatures from legends and like horror movies, things like that. And so these campers are trying to defend themselves, but figuring out why all these creatures are here. I loved the art style of this. I thought it was really fun. I really liked the themes of female friendship. However, the actual plot of the story was so slow moving. I feel like we really didn't do much in this first volume, because really by the end of the book, I didn't feel like we knew anything substantially different from the beginning of the book. So yeah, I gave this one 4 stars. It was fun, entertaining. I'm gonna continue on with the series, but I'm gonna be a little bit more critical, I think, in book 2. Then I read another disappointing book. January was a month of disappointments for me, apparently. And this was The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. I've gone back and forth on my rating on this. I'm somewhere between 2 to 3 stars. Sometimes when I think of it, I'm closer to 3. Sometimes when I think of it, I'm closer to 2. I really hate how hyped this book is as like this thriller, because it's absolutely not a thriller in my opinion. It's so slow moving. It's not very climatic. It's not one that builds up suspense well. I actually thought it was incredibly drawn out. There's such a large cast of characters, and I feel like most of the information we get about them is pretty irrelevant to the story. There are so many red herrings in this that just felt so completely useless. And I felt a lot of the times like I was reading the same events or conversations over and over again. And I just really didn't like that. I thought that this was, for how long it was a pretty boring story. Like, I didn't really feel invested in the characters. I didn't really feel invested in the mystery aspects. And then when we finally get a big reveal about both of the mysteries, because this is a story about a brother that had gone missing 10 years or 12 years, I think, before the start of the book, and then his sister goes missing at the same like summer camp. By the time we get the big reveals in this story, one of the big reveals felt so incredibly ridiculous considering like the times, the circumstances surrounding it. I was just like, this is completely dumb. Like, there was just no need for all of this. And then the other one I felt was half-baked. Like, I could see how it worked, but it was all so perfectly wrapped up in a bow that I just didn't care. And I think that's the biggest problem I have with this book is like, I didn't care about it. Like, I read it, okay. It was entertaining in parts, but the majority of it was not. Big disappointment there. I'm realizing that a lot of books I had really high hopes for from famous authors or from hyped like lists or recommendations are just not really hitting for me. After The God of the Woods, I returned to the Percy Jackson series and read book 4, The Battle of the Labyrinth. I think this one is my favorite of the series. I thought that this had such interesting action in it. I really loved the return to like the original group that we followed, but I liked that they also had these side quests. It was just a really fascinating story. I love the mythos of the Labyrinth and how it really brought a lot of different stories together in this. It was one that I really enjoyed. And it made me a little sad because now I'm nearing the end of the series. I mean, obviously I'll still have many more Rick Riordan series to read. Yeah, it was a really good way to return to the series for me personally. I gave it a 4.5 stars because I really did enjoy my time with this. And even thinking back, I read this basically in one day because I truly could not stop listening to it. I've been listening to the audio that I think is narrated by Jesse Bernstein, and they're amazing audiobooks. They're really fun. But that one was truly one I could not stop listening to. It was great. After that, I read something completely out of my comfort zone. This is a collection of sci-fi stories called Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, and I had to watch a talk with the author after reading this because I felt so confused about what I had read and how I felt about what I read. So the stories are kind of like Black Mirror episodes in a way. Like, they feel very much like these sci-fi distorted realities of Earth and like conflicts, whether those be like social conflicts, political conflicts, or even environmental ones. I thought some of the stories were really well done in this, and there's so much nuance that the author brings to some of the stories that are about more social issues. Like, the ones that I can think of are, in the beginning, there's a story about like a group of children who have been murdered, and like there's this whole trial that's unfolding because it's a very brutal, violent attack by this white man. And later in the book, there's also this story about like Black Friday and how it becomes like this massacre. And so there are these stories in the book that really accurately reflect like current socio-political issues. And I think that the way that Brenyah explores these are really fascinating. However, there were also some stories where I really could not understand what I was supposed to take away from this. There's one story in particular that I was trying to find literally any interview where the author talks about this, and it's never mentioned in what I could find. But it's a story that's told from the point of view of aborted fetuses. And it was really weird to me because it made it seem like the author was supporting an anti-abortion standpoint. But considering the context of other stories in the book, I don't think that was his intent. But every interview that I was able to find about this collection specifically, because I didn't watch any about Chain Gang All Stars, because if you can't see, it's on my shelf still, so I haven't read it yet. So I was only looking at the ones for Friday Black, and literally none of the interviews mentioned this, and I found this to be really frustrating because when listening to the one long talk that I listened to, which I will actually link down below, it was very fascinating to hear the author's thoughts on these stories and like what he was trying to convey to the reader. And I do think that he was not trying to promote an anti-abortion rhetoric in that story, but I just didn't get it if that's not what he was trying to do. So yeah, that's how I felt about this one. I really was conflicted. I don't think it was a bad collection. I think in many ways it's very brilliant, but in other ways, I'm left wondering, what was I supposed to take away from it? And if I can't understand the messaging of certain ones, I feel like that is a problem, and maybe that's a problem for me as a reader, but reading is subjective. So I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. It has left me eager to read more of his work, but also skeptical because it got pretty dark and gory in this. So it's made me a little worried that I need to be in a certain headspace to be reading Chain Gang All Stars. The last book that I finished in January was Best Hex Ever by Nadia El-Fassi. This is a witchy romance book that was so good. It's about this witch who, in this world, each witch has like a specialty for their power, and hers is in baking. And so she owns a bakery, and this guy comes in and she finds him very attractive, but it's like a, like a chance encounter. Well, then her best friend is getting married, and the groom's best man is the guy from the coffee shop. And so they have this attraction. They're in close proximity because they're staying in like a little cottage during the wedding. So of course sparks fly. I thought this was a really fun read. I definitely enjoyed my time with it. I also really liked how the author focused on Nadia's own journey of like self-love in this book, of accepting herself, and the themes of female friendship and womanhood in this. I really love Nadia's mother in this story. I thought that she was very sweet, and I just felt like there was such a loving support around Nadia, even when Nadia couldn't feel that. I also really liked that it had dual POVs, because I often find that this is a downfall of certain romances where I only get one character's perspective, and so it's hard for me to understand how the other love interest feels. In this one, I really liked how that was explored, and that when we're in the male love interest's head, there is much more development of his character. It's not just like, this is how I feel, or like, this is what I'm doing. It was a genuine exploration of him as a character and his life outside of his interactions with Nadia. This book just perfectly encapsulated those like cozy vibes to me. It's one that I'm already considering rereading around November because I really enjoyed this. I ended up giving this one 4.5 out of 5 stars. I've thought a lot about this book since finishing it. I would definitely count it as one of my favorites for the month. My favorites altogether would probably be Propa Propaganda, Beartown, and then The Best Text Ever. All for very different reasons, but I think that these were really genuinely my favorites of everything that I read because they're all 3 ones that I haven't stopped thinking about in one way or another. Now, time to talk about the one DNF I had this month, and this is The Herbalist's Secret. This book was so confusing to me. I made it, I think, about like 20 to 30% of the way through this, and I could not understand what this story was trying to tell. There's like the story of these children, and there's the story of this house and this woman who worked as an herbalist and these people that are still living in the house. And then there's a story of this woman who's now buying the house. And I just was like, there's so many things going on here and nothing is really going deeper. It all felt very surface level, and I didn't really feel any attachment or pull to the characters. So I didn't have a reason to really keep reading, and I don't really regret it. When I was looking at reviews of this, because usually when I DNF, I look at reviews to kind of see what people are saying. A lot of the reviews echoed my sentiments that this is a very long book that's very meandering, and it didn't really need to be. There are all of these storylines that don't really come together cohesively, and by the point that they do technically like overlap, it's so far into the story, and I know that I would not find that worth it. So I ended up DNFing this one. I don't give a rating for DNFs, but yeah, only one DNF for the year so far. So those are all the books that I read or attempted to read in January. I would love to know if you've read any of these books and what your thoughts are on them. Please put those down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you so much for watching. Happy reading. Bye.